Hey, what's up guys, it's Bakes and thank you for joining me for another episode of my random horror reviews. Today's movie was a first time watch for myself, though I've heard a lot of people say that this is a really underrated classic horror movie, so it definitely had me intrigued. The movie is from 1961 and it is titled The Innocents. Yeah, so as I said, a first time watch for myself, but I was definitely excited to check this one out just purely because it's from 61 and still so many people say this movie is highly underrated, so finally got around to watching it. As usual, we'll quickly go through the plot for this movie before I get into my thoughts of it. So the plot in this one, Miss Giddens, who is played by Deborah Kerr, is hired to be the governess of these two children. I believe their parents have passed away, and they're meant to be looked after by their uncle, but their uncle's like really rich and he doesn't really care to be looking after them, so she's hired in to be the governess and take care of these kids. And at first, they seem very well mannered and, normal kids. However, some sinister, dark secrets start to come out, and she starts to try and figure out the mystery of what's really going on with these kids and their history. So that's pretty much the plot for this movie, and let's get into my thoughts of 1961's The Innocents. So as I was talking about the plot before, you might have thought to yourself, I've heard that story somewhere before. This is an adaptation of The Turn of the Screw. However, at least for myself, I've never seen an adaptation for that story before, or at least I don't think I have. It's never really rung a bell for me. So for me, this was a pretty new and fresh story. However, when a lot of people talk about The Innocents, they say, there's been too many adaptations of The Turn of the Screw before that we've seen, so it's hard to sort of get invested in this story when we've seen it over and over. But for me, as I said, I didn't really have that problem. It seemed like something I wasn't too familiar with. Obviously, there's things that are similar just because this movie is from 61, so you're just bound to have a story somewhat like it, but for the most part, as I said, I am pretty new to the Turn of the Screw story. But moving on, getting to some positives with this film, I really liked the score. I thought the music in this movie was really well done. It was very dreamlike and whimsical and very typical for things that you see in the 50s and 60s. Just the score was really well done. It was also really well acted. It's not a very big cast at all, but the child actors did a good job, and everyone that came into play in this movie did a really good job. Another thing that I want to highlight is the sets and the locations in this movie. Everything was just immaculate. I guess like the main location was this big mansion or manor, whatever you want to call it. It looked really, really well done. The gardens looked beautiful. I just really liked the setting and location in this one. It just looked beautiful. Unfortunately, that's sort of where the positives end for me, because most of the things that I want to bring up are negatives. I know I sort of cut the positives short there. But moving into the negatives, I just feel like this movie had lots of padding and sort of repetitive scenes, going over and over. There was that many scenes that I counted where it was almost just repeated content, Deborah Kerr's character, Miss Giddens, having conversations about the previous people in charge, passing away, repeated conversations about going to seek help, repeated conversations about sending letters to people that would know more about the kids, and it just sort of, a scene like that would happen, 5 minutes pass, and then another scene like that would happen, and it just went over and over, and I was like, oh my god, we're not really building to anything here. It was just sort of slow, and it wouldn't really ever get to a point. It just seemed like a lot of beating around the bush, this movie. There was small, sort of hints at where the story was going, but it just sort of dragged on at a very, slow pace. And this movie is 95 minutes, so it's not insanely long, but I just feel like too much of this movie was padding and cushioning, and it just didn't really get any traction for me. And by the end of the movie, the build-up was just so slow, the reveal just didn't really seem worth it, and that's unfortunate because the reveal at the end and sort of the twist or whatever you want to call it isn't that bad, but it just doesn't feel well rewarded with a really slow and demanding build-up. So keeping this review short and sharp and wrapping up my final thoughts of The Innocents, this movie was very disappointing for myself. As I said, it's a story that has so many adaptations, but I'm not too familiar with it, so it could have been something very refreshing and new. And as I said, it's one that I've heard very high things about, being very underrated for a movie from 61. But as I said, it just felt very lackluster. So many scenes repeated and just lots of filler and beating around the bush, and it just didn't really ever get to a point. And by the time it got to the end, it was just sort of like, well, was the build up worth it? As I said, there was things to highlight in there: the acting, the locations, the score. The movie looked good. Just unfortunately, the story just felt very padded. Took a long time to sort of get there, and then by the end, as I said, was the reveal really worth it? So giving this a score out of 10, I'm going to give The Innocents from 1961 a 4 out of 10. Yeah, it's one that I'll eventually come back and revisit sometime in the future, and maybe I'll appreciate it more. But this time around, I just couldn't get involved with the story. It was just taking too long to get to a certain point, and in the end, I'm like, well, fuck, like, it's just not really doing it for me. And yeah, as I said, in the end, a little bit disappointing. But if you have your different thoughts of this movie, let me know in the comments below. But either way, I'll see you for another video soon, guys, and I appreciate you joining me for this episode. Peace.